control of heart rate. Okay, so control of heart rate is mostly going to look at the SAN is the most important thing here. It's going to initiate the heartbeat. So this is a very classic answer. These key terms that I'm going to put here, or this little sequence, is going to pick up loads of marks when it comes to this kind of question. So there is a whole video on the structure of the heart, so I'm going to be using terms here. I'm going to expect you to know what they are. If you don't know what they are, then go back and watch the video on the structure of the human heart or the mammalian heart. So the SAN initiates the heartbeat. We can sometimes say acts as the pacemaker. Next up, we can say it sends an electrical impulse across the atria. Atria plural, atrium singular. So that causes, well, they receive this electrical impulse. It's not a nerve impulse. We're going to come across the word myogenic. Myogenic means it initiates, it controls this itself. It doesn't need a nerve impulse in order for this to fire, so it's organizing itself. This causes the atria to contract. Now, there's also, this nerve impulse is stopped from going down to the ventricles by a non-conductive tissue. So let's say non-conductive tissue prevents electrical impulses reaching the ventricles. Next up, this electrical impulse arrives at the AVN, the atrioventricular node. So the AVN, the role of that is to delay this electrical impulse. And this is a following on point. What's the importance of that? This allows the atria to contract and empty before the ventricles contract. So we can now say the AVN sends this electrical impulse down the bundle of His to the Purkinje fibers. A lot of the mark schemes spell this with a capital B. Not too sure why. The should be a capital H, it's named after a person, so that's a proper noun, should be a capital. And along, the different pronunciations of this, Purkinje tends to be the way it's pronounced. And then once we're down the bottom of the heart, this will cause the ventricles to contract from the base up. Okay, so this sequence of statements in the initiation and control of heart rate is frequently asked, and these are the best words to use on the exam to guarantee you're going to get most of those marks. I'm going to populate the rest of the page with a few other bits and pieces that frequently come up during exam questions on this same topic. Let's retitle this. Left ventricle. Let's look at the left ventricle. Again, frequently comes up because it's probably one of the more important chambers of the heart. They don't often ask about the right atria for right atrium. So why the left ventricle? Well, it has the highest blood pressure. Why does it have the greatest blood pressure? Because it's got the most cardiac muscle, so it contracts with a greater force. And why is this necessary? Is because it pumps blood to the whole body. You may also be asked to be given a diagram, could be beats per minute, could be a graph, could be an ECG if your specification requires you to know that. So I'm going to put here calculating heart rate. So, for example, let's draw a little graph. So we've got a gap, and then maybe it could be blood pressure, and we're going to end up with these basically peaks. When a heart contracts the proper word for it is systole or systole. And when it's relaxed, it's diastole. So we could say atrial systole is followed by ventricular systole, followed by both atria and ventricles in diastole. Okay, so we've got a pretty rough looking graph here. Axes, should put them on, shouldn't I? Time, it's always going to be in seconds. Let's say this is blood pressure. Okay, so you want to count, ideally you want to count one. Pick a point that is identifiable. So if we're taking these, we could look at like what would be the nipple right on the end here, the peak. That's going to be quite identifiable. If it's a bit round, then maybe there's a sharp rise here. Then going from the sharp rise is going to be the best thing. If it's not totally regular, it might ask you to calculate the average, in which case you'd maybe count all 4 and then work out how long 4 takes and then divide by 4. Be a bit careful. Sometimes they want you to be very specific, down to the smallest square that you can read. So I have seen questions where this goes down to, it looks like it's 1 second, but they're actually looking for 0.98 seconds. So be very accurate and use a ruler and be very careful. So let's take here some examples. On this graph, I think this is probably the sharpest, most identifiable point. And we've got, maybe we'll take another one here, and we'll work out what it takes to do 2. So let's say 2 beats is maybe 2.2 seconds. So we obviously then need to divide this by 2, because it's 2 beats, and we get 1.1 seconds per beat. It might ask you to calculate heart rate per minute. That's what we normally calculate heart rate in. So 1.1 second is 1 cardiac cycle. So we'd then have to do 60 seconds divided by how many beats per second. And in this case, that sum works out to be, always use a calculator, even if it's super easy, because it's very, very easy to make mistakes. 5.4, this is actually 5.4, 5.4, 5.4 recurring. So you'd round this to 54.55 beats per minute. The last thing I'm going to do is a bit of a summary table. This is very commonly asked about the valves, whether they're open, whether they're closed. So we're going to look at the phase of the cardiac cycle. We're going to look at what happens in the atria. We're going to look what happens in the ventricles. We're going to see whether the atrioventricular valves are doing. And we're going to look what the semilunar valves are doing. Okay, so you may get taught these are bicuspid and tricuspid. I don't believe any of the specifications require you to know the difference between bicuspid and tricuspids. Atrioventricular is much easier to get correct. So it's very easy to make mistakes with the bicuspid and the tricuspid. I suggest that you just call them the atrioventricular valves. If you do WJEC, I might just double check that information. But I know that OCR, AQA, and Edexcel don't require you to know. So I need 3 lines in here. Let's see if I can squeeze them in. Just about. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 phases of the cardiac cycle. We're going to look at atrial systole. Remember, systole is contraction. We're going to look at ventricular systole, when the ventricles are contracting, and diastole. So easy way to remember this, if you're dead, your heart is not beating anymore, it's not contracting, so diastole is in fully relaxed state, just as if you were dead, whereas systole is the other one. That's simply all you need to remember it. So during atrial systole, not going to surprise you that these are contracted. And when the atria are contracting, the ventricles are relaxed. And it's going to be the opposite way around, obviously. So when the ventricles are contracting, the atria are relaxed, and vice versa. Okay, so I'm also going to put the pressures in, which is why I've left a little bit of a gap underneath here. But let's follow this through. This is the most commonly when they ask about the atrioventricular valves, the AV valves. So during atrial systole, high pressure in the atria. In fact, let's put the pressures in now. If the atria are contracting, the blood pressure inside them is high. If the ventricles are relaxed, the blood pressure inside them is low. The pressure is higher in the atria than it is in the ventricles, so the atrioventricular valves are open. And what are the semilunar valves going to do? Well, they're going to be closed. They could, because the pressure in the ventricles is low, the pressure in the aorta, where the blood has just come out from, or we could say the pulmonary artery, is going to be higher than it is in the ventricles, which is why the semilunar valves are closed, if you're looking for a reason. The other way around, obviously here we're going to have, it's relaxed, so there's low pressure. When the ventricles are contracting, we're going to have high pressure, highest in the left ventricle, remember. So the atrioventricular valves will be closed and the semilunar valves will be open. And during diastole, both the atria and the ventricles are both relaxed. However, the atria are being filled up by the vena cava and the pulmonary vein, so these are filling, which means this is low, it's not at high pressure, but the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles, because this is totally empty, and this one is being filled up. So there is a little bit of flow coming in, and as a result, there is a little bit of blood draining from the atria into the ventricles. So because the pressure here is in the atria is greater than the ventricles, the atrioventricular valves are open. And during this time, the heart is relaxing. It's just done its pump. The ventricle is like opening out again. So you've got very low pressure in the ventricle. That means the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary artery is greater. So the semilunar valves are closed. It's a little bit of a task to get your head around it the first time. These are the things that come up in the questions most frequently when you're talking about control of heart rate.